today. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming to this FGPS webinar. We're going to go through how to talk about race and white fragility as a mental health provider. This is a complex topic, and there's a lot of difficult things that can come up for people. So I just want to go through some ground rules, expectations, if there is a dialogue and time at the end for this about racism and something you can maybe take with you. Typically when we have spaces like this with difficult conversations, we want to say that you can't judge other people, to not make assumptions, assume the good intentions of the people that you're talking to, and have respect for one another. Okay, so just being mindful of your tone and everything else. Seems like understandable ground rules to have, and here's why we can't do any of those when we talk about race. When you say don't judge, you're talking about refraining from judgment, which we as humans, we judge. We judge people all the time, we categorize, we label. That's part of our human nature. And it's not so much about not making a judgment, but being aware and mindful of what your judgments are, what your biases are, because you can't stop those from happening. It's part of your culture and the way that you've been raised within this society, within your families. Don't make assumptions. Well, that kind of assumes that the very nature of it is that assumptions are knowable to you, and that's not the case. An assumption is something that is inherent and just pops into your mind subconsciously or otherwise. So can't really do that. Assume good intentions. So this is a common problem when we talk about race and racism, microaggressions. By doing this, we kind of prioritize the good intentions of the aggressor over the impact their behavior has on the target or person in mind. So it implies if there's no intent to do harm, others should let go of the hurt and move on. And that does a really good job of sustaining this idea of white racial innocence. If I'm not intending to do anything bad, then I can't be held responsible for my actions. We'll talk more about that in a bit. And with respect, let's talk about what feels respectful to white people compared to people of color. And this differences of experiences that we have, white people as a privilege, we can talk about our comfort level in conversations, right? And when it comes to difficult dialogues, if we feel like we're being chastised or yelled at, our immediate reaction, like most people who are being yelled at, would be like, oh, okay, I don't want to engage in this, and I'm going to ask you to tone your voice down. But again, part of this is being able to recognize that is something that we may take for granted in the conversations and spaces that we have throughout our lives. And for people who are coming from consistent traumatic experiences, racial trauma, this is something that's very raw and energetic, and the way that they speak shouldn't decline the impact of the message that they're trying to get across. Should not discount that. So that's just one of the many different kinds of behaviors that we'll discuss. So the purpose of this workshop, there's so many different directions we could take this, but I'm thinking of this in terms of, I want us to be able to build up our racial stamina, to bear witness to the pain of racism that we cause, not to impose conditions that will continue our own denial about this. And my hope is that by both talking about this from our intrapersonal lens, we can also talk about how you deal with this in different interpersonal relationships. So focusing more on the how rather than if our racism is manifesting in our behaviors or other people's behaviors. Become curious and eager about how to manage our racist patterns rather than proving that they don't exist. Define racism, microaggressions, and white fragility. We're going to focus on some common defenses when speaking about race or white fragility, and then some strategies to intervene with microaggressions and white fragility. The idea is to hopefully stretch our worldview and interrupt this concept of our own internal superiority around this topic. So microaggressions, if we thought about a definition for that, these are the everyday slights, insults, put downs, invalidations, offensive that people of color experience in daily interactions with generally well-intentioned white Americans who may be unaware that they've engaged in some racial and demeaning ways. It's important to think about microaggressions not meaning that it's a small act, even though it can present in very covert ways, but it's just coming from an individual source. So some people have criticized the use of the word micro because it seems minuscule. And you also have to think of this in terms of microaggressions can come from yourself in this person-to-person, interpersonal level, as well as an environmental level through media and other sources. So we have this constant invalidation social climate that we have in the US that's blind to a majority group's experiences. And there's a YouTube video. I'm actually gonna, after I'm done speaking and we go to the Q&A, post in the chat some information on, or I'll post the PowerPoint so people have access to this. And it has a lot of references and materials in it. This YouTube video just is a very, I think, helpful guide in terms of focusing on how microaggressions could be seen as mosquito bites, because it gives a nice perspective on, for a person that gets bit every once in a while by a mosquito, it may not bother you that much and you may not think twice about it. It's something you don't really have to deal with. But for those who are bitten all the time in different ways throughout their lives, when they finally get fed up of being bit and you're the person who did the last mosquito bite, and then you get very confused and scared and kind of taken aback by their anger or emotional reaction, just recognize that you're not the first time that that's happened, and there's this built up over time experience that eventually comes out in people, and you want to be mindful of not taking that as, personal in that way, and being aware of how you can still be accepting and want to hear what they have to say. So going to another point about, are you a racist? There's this old definition of racist, which is a person who believes in racism, the doctrine that one's own racial group is superior, or that a particular racial group is inferior to others. And that definition is really antiquated nowadays, because it makes it so that it's only a singular person, ignores the systemic influence of racism within the US or any other cultures. This is across different world domains as well. Creates this good-bad binary. And so if I don't say or do anything overtly racist, then I'm one of the good ones. Thus, I don't really need to reflect or grow on anything. And it speaks to this consciously held belief that a person, holds their racial group as superior or another is inferior, which, really limits the amount of people that say that out loud. And so it kind of eschews a lot of responsibility from many white people if we just stay with this definition. So a different way of framing it, and this is from one of the books that we got this information from, is when an individual identifies in a dominated race that holds systemic or institutional powers that serves to help them consciously or subconsciously hold them in that power and continue to oppress other marginalized races. So when you think of it like this, try and take a step back and depersonalize that no one is exempt from racism or being racist in a racist system. This is kind of the water that we're in this environment, and this country was founded on this. So it shouldn't come as a surprise, and it's, as we'll talk about, maybe even a bit narcissistic to think that you could be the one to be the exception to that rule. Another view which I really find helpful by Ibram X. Kendi was how he defines racist and anti-racist. So what it means to be a racist, in his view, is one who's supporting a racist policy through actions or inactions, or expressing a racist idea, whereas the opposite is one is who's supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. He talks about this in terms of, think of being racist or anti-racist as a sticker, like a label that you can have on you and off you throughout your experiences. And it's not about having a fixed identity of you're just racist, right? You can be racist one minute and anti-racist the next. And what we say about race, what we do in each moment kind of determines what, not who we are. I really connect with this because I think it again allows us to have this dialogue where you as a person are not awful. We get away from this good-bad binary just because you did something wrong. We get out of this mindset of that's the thing that defines you throughout your life. And it allows you to be more self-aware and kind of gives you a critical eye to yourself, as well as just assists with self-examination. There's a story that's described in one of the books that I'll reference later, I think by Ijeoma Oluo, that talks about if you've had some drinks at a bar and you were heading home and you came across somebody and ended up beating them up or being physically aggressive with them, and that really like scared them, traumatized them. And then after you wake up the next day, you realize, oh my God, what have I done? I have a really big problem with this. This is not okay. You can get treatment. You can become an advocate. You may speak at local schools or run AA meetings, or really be seen by many people as a hero and somebody who's really forwarding a righteous cause. And for that person that you beat up that night, you're still going to be a monster. You're still going to be scary. And you don't have to fix that. They don't have to forgive you. You can hold on to both parts of you. Like in that, this is the idea of holding on to a paradox instead of solving it. The more that we can do that and hold on to that dialectic view of ourselves, the easier it'll be to do this kind of work. So for Helms' white identity model, I don't want to go into a lot of this, but I just wanted to give some like theoretical like perspective on it. He describes it in 6 different stages. When you're in contact, you're colorblind. Racism is propagated by discussing race. You know, if there's no conscious demonstration, there's no racism. And again, we all fall into this. I know for me, when I was being raised by my father, who's from North Africa, he was from Algeria, he always used to tell me that, you know, he doesn't understand how people can hate one another in these kinds of ways because of skin color. We're all the same, you know, underneath. We're all pink underneath our skin. And I think he meant well with where he was coming from that. But to keep that mindset, and I had that mindset for a while growing up, it kind of eschews this idea of, you know, that everything is the same and equal, like footing, and kind of lets us let go of this idea that this system that we're in is still currently broken and that we need to take active steps to change it. So if we move on to the second stage of disintegration, that's when you start to have some realizations about this. You start feeling plagued by feelings of guilt and shame, having your worldview challenged. It can be from an experience of seeing somebody be racist. It can be, you know, a realization that somebody calls you out and you have to reflect on what you did and how that wasn't harmful towards someone else. And you can either you can channel that in more positive or negative ways. If you channel it in kind of a negative way, you might go into this reintegration, kind of blaming the victim attitude. Well, yes, whites have privilege, but it's because we deserve it, or we justify it in some like different ways. Maybe making it about like, oh, it's more just like the class that you're brought into. It's not about race. You can kind of dance around that topic. Another way that you can do it if you're making this energy in more positive ways is to have this pseudo-independence stage where you don't feel like you deserve privilege, but you look to BIPOC individuals to confront and uncover racism. You know, you're kind of comforted and you approve of other people's efforts and attempts to be anti-racist, and you're uncertain how to be white and anti-racist at the same time. Almost seems like a contradiction. Then we shift to this immersion stage where there's a genuine concern about your own white identity, a deep concern with your understanding and connecting, wanting to connect with other whites on the issues of racism. And then for the final stage, this autonomy of you understand your white identity, you actively pursue social justice and become an active anti-racist. So when you're talking to people, or if you even view yourself, like it might be helpful to reflect on where you are in this process and how that's looked throughout your life, just to again personalize that this is something we all like go through in this identity. No one is born woke to all the things and the injustices going on around us. We learn these things over time. So be compassionate about yourself as you take, you know, your journey in this. Now, how do we handle being personally hurt or when we're feeling attacked? This is something you can reflect on again for yourself, as well as how people will most likely respond if you try and point out microaggression, racism, or other things in your life. We tend to get into this fight, flight, freeze response, and that response is pretty well known to a lot of people in terms of it shutting down our cognitive or critical thinking, like functioning. Again, part of this is, I think it comes from this good-bad binary that we put racism in which, you know, if you're not a member of the Klan or involved in some really overt racist activity, then you feel like you shouldn't belong, like stooped up with those people. And so you feel this deep morale blow to yourself of being viewed and associated with those individuals that you may really disagree with. there's this idea of needing to explain yourself that actually comes up when we feel attacked. If the person just understood what I meant, they would clearly not be hurt anymore, rather than exploring what is it I did that was hurtful? How can I be curious about this moment and reflect on how I can improve myself, as opposed to just trying to explain it away. So the sequence of events that may unfold is kind of need to discuss how systemic racism is within all of us, that nobody gets immune to this. And then when you get feedback or an illustration of problematic behavior, you're going to feel this anxiety of being judged as the problem, or you may think you're being labeled as racist. And so these fight-flight response, again, if you're fighting against this explaining reasoning, you may argue your point, dismiss the argument. You just don't have a sense of humor or what have you. You might go into flight where you just want to leave, or you start to cry because you're so upset at the idea of being classified in this way. Or you might shut down, refuse to engage any further. You kind of get in this emotional state where, again, you're closing off any further learning. And so when we're talking to people about these topics, which I think ultimately a lot of us that are here today are really trying to figure out, how do we engage in a dialogue without having this be the response that people jump to, or if they do jump to it, as it's a natural thing to do, how do we get them back to a place where they can be engaged and take in and internalize this message that we're trying to get across? So for you, when you feel an emotion, a physical urge, it might be helpful to ask yourself, what is it that I'm feeling? And if it's anxiety, like about being misperceived, how can I turn this anxiety into curiosity? System-centered group theory talks a lot about how anxiety, when it's shifted into curiosity, can be a very helpful way of taking in messages and not taking things just personally in this. So if you take a second to even think about, if this is true for me, what this person is telling me, that I did something that was impactful, what would that mean? Like, what would I want to do about it? And again, thinking about that in terms of the kernel of truth you can take away from this message, as opposed to dismissing it entirely. So when we talk about white supremacy is essentially inherent in a lot of the messages that we receive in society. It's like white is right. It's the bedrock of the society and what we've been raised in. Again, this country being built on slaves, and then the systems being built from that, continued to find ways to oppress people of color, indigenous people throughout the history, and continuously there have been more rights being given, and there's been a shift, but all of those systems are still in place and reinforce this idea to keep the white like on top in it. And everything is kind of made for me in that, right? Like white is almost held up as the norm for humanity. Thinking about this for yourself, but I know this feels true for me. I live in a majority throughout all my spaces in my life, seeing other white people. I don't necessarily consider race like when I choose to travel. Like I don't worry about not seeing other people like me if I'm going in a different place in the US. Racism doesn't feel like a problem to me. I can walk around my neighborhood with my daughter going on walks, and I don't have to think about what people might be like doing, or if people are going to become like violent. It allows me a lot of emotional, intellectual space to not have to worry as I'm being, going around shopping, to not be followed by the clerk to see if I'm going to steal something. There's a lot of very small things that, again, individually may not seem like much, but if we think about that constant social pressure that can come from these microaggressions, it can be overwhelming and all-consuming at times. And then obviously viewing the news and everything in the most recent months has highlighted this to the nth degree. So saying, racism just isn't my problem, and then having this idea of white solidarity where as white people, it's very difficult for us to give feedback to other whites on observed racist actions or behaviors. Because if we do, then there's this idea of like, you're being too PC, you can't take a joke. Obviously, I didn't mean that. If people get angry at us or combative, they're not, they may, even in your job, you may not feel like you're suited to go further in this organization. And so there's real consequences that could happen from speaking out and speaking up about these. And then, this idea of if you dismiss the racial joke that somebody makes and, kind of play along with it or go along, not ruining the fun, so to speak, you get rewarded you get praise, you get to be seen as fun or cooperative, a team player. And again, these kinds of situations can really reinforce this narrative of how we keep everything the way it is in society. So in a way, white people's moral objection to racism can tend to be a double-edged sword, because although it's good to have a moral objection to it, it also increases the resistance to acknowledging that we're all complicit in our own ways to it as well. It was surveyed a few years back that a majority of whites, 55%, felt discriminated against today, specifically like in the workforce. And then a much smaller percentage actually say that they've been discriminated against. I think it was around 30 or 20% actually say that they've been actively discriminated against. But the perceptions are there in this way. There's also this idea of the higher in mobility that you go up in a company or in spaces socially, it tends to take you to more white spaces. There tends to be less diversity as you get closer to the top of any system or hierarchy. Most whites don't really keep cross-racial relationships across their lives. And just think about what the inherent message is in that our culture is one that we don't really value cross-racial relationships across the lifespan. It's not something we see as necessary or even a bad thing. Most stories only describe characters of race when they're non-white, because again, white is the default. You almost just picture that inherently. And then, seeing yourself as an individual who's exempt from that racist society, you can kind of say like, well, I'm one of the good ones, right? I'm one of the ones that's fighting the good fight. So again, some of these myths that people will often get into to get rid of their own responsibility is, my learning's finished. I kind of know all I need. I've graduated. I've got a PhD in psychology. I've obviously understand the suffering, and I'm multiculturally competent. My suffering that I've had in life is, kind of relieved me of the burden of racism. Like I grew up poor. It's a common one that comes up, and it's not that that's, not something that you can struggle with and be very valid in talking about how that's impacted you, but it is not the same and a false equivalence to what it's like to grow up in a different racial category. Being entitled, like we were talking before about feeling comfortable in conversations, recognizing that like racism is not just a conscious thing, but can be unconscious. And having these things like, oh, I have friends of color, or if I can't see it, then it's not legitimately happening. And there's a oversimplification at times where people just say, well, people just need to be kind to each other. And that's the way it goes out. And again, it makes it more of an individual problem as opposed to systemic change that needs to occur. Kind of takes these points all together, and it makes it so that you really have no entry points to be reflective and curious about your own contributions to this, as well as the systems and enactments of racism that occur in society. Another thing to keep in mind is we actually talk about race still, like pretty openly. We just code it in different ways to make us feel less responsible about it in our culture. And so interchangeably in society, we substitute Black or other kind of people of color words with more socially acceptable terms when we speak to one another. If we say, I hear that school's urban and has low test scores in the area, we say, oh, that area is not safe. I think it has a lot of crime. A pack of thugs were rioting. You get a picture of like, oh, we actually mean Black, but we're not saying it. We're just kind of coding our language to be safer about it. There's other things that are more obvious, like illegal aliens, that really paint a negative picture. And also when people kind of talk about, I wish we could go back to the good old days, you can also think about like, well, what were the good old days? Like, what does that imply? Does that imply the days where whites were higher in power? Because if you think about the good old days from the perspective of BIPOC individuals, that's a very different experience and not exactly fond memories in a lot of ways. So, and even in our more legal system and the more systemic ways in which we view things, when white children, are being judged, they tend to be given external reasons as to why they're the way they are. Oh, they come from a single parent home, this kid, he was just having a really hard time, and I would not want to ruin this kid's career just because he assaulted this one person. So there's like lighter sentences given to white individuals. We see this in the news all the time. BIPOC children are seen as more having this core internal factors. They're more prone to crimes. They're generalized and labeled as thugs. They're almost taken in this animalistic way, and they don't get any kind of sense or capacity for remorse with that. So how does it feel, this idea of white fragility? There's a discomfort and defensiveness on the part of the white person. when we're confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice that we've done specifically. It's specific to the white phenomenon, and it means to reproduce or further support white supremacy in this. And I like to also consider how we can equate it to the idea of a narcissistic injury, or kind of an intrapersonal reckoning with one's view of yourself. Because white culture tends to value individuality, meaning we interpret judgment with immense personal responsibility. Just think about it in terms of some of the adages that's typically associated with white American culture, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's like how you'll be successful in life, right? There's a sense of you can do it on your own. And so when we get told that we are this label, we can immediately have this overwhelming emotional response, like we're having a loss of control. We did something we didn't intend to do. And that can mean that we lose our composure, we lose our emotional balance, we can go into a state of white tears. And that has a lot of meaning historically in terms of how white tears have been used to hurt or even justify killings of people of color. And also, it tends to make the white person be the person that needs to be taken care of now, whether it's intentional or not. I mean, people can get emotional and cry, but you need to be cognizant of what message you might be sending, and maybe preface that you don't need to be taken care of right now and that you're doing okay, even if you are being tearful in this moment, not to take away from the other person's distress. And so again, this idea of holding us in this white racial innocence category where racism is not our problem. So how do we approach people about race and or white fragility? First, it's just like you to step back, reflect on what the context is for your dialogue. Is this person that you're talking to someone that's attending this webinar who's willing to be here? Is it something that's an adjacent learning experience? So maybe they're in a group therapy for understanding yourself and others. And so you could see that there's a benefit to that in this space. Are they unknowingly going to be put on the spot in this and they weren't expecting to have a talk about race? Or are they being forced in this way to talk about it in this moment? And also it's important to think about what's your power with them, between you and the other identities that this person might hold. Are you in a place of higher power? Are you kind of the same power like your colleagues? Different identities that you share or differ with may determine a lot of this. Or are they in lower power than you? And what barriers might prevent you from being seen or heard in terms of the emotional, cognitive, behavioral ones? It's important to ask yourself also, how are you feeling in this moment given the answers above? I think especially for people of color that are wanting to engage in this kind of work, it's important to recognize our own self-care, the consequences for our actions, as well as the consequences for our inaction. And there's many ways we can take action. It doesn't have to be a, you said something or you didn't. We'll talk about different ways to intervene, to say what level of intervention can I do in this moment? And Sue, I think, talk about these outcomes that you want to get from confronting microaggressions. And that could be wanting to remain passive or retreat from this harm that's been done, strike back to hurt them, stop, diminish, deflect the end of the harm that's being done to somebody else, educate the perpetrator, validate and support the target of the microaggression, act as an ally, seek social support, enlist outside or institutional interventions. And I also think at the end of the day, it's important to think about, what do I value? What am I working towards by engaging in this dialogue? Am I working towards living in a world that embraces anti-racist beliefs, that there isn't a difference between different racial categories? Because some of these instinctive values that we have are going to be the driving force when things get really hard to talk about these topics. People that identify as white and are anti-racist activists talk a lot about the distress that they feel being activists because they're constantly criticized by other people and also people of color for doing it wrong. And so they get a lot of feedback and they're open to that. But it's difficult. And you shouldn't be expectant of a reward or a cookie, right, for this kind of work. You're doing it for something more meaningful than an individual's, hey, thanks for this great talk you did on white fragility today, right? This is about a greater purpose than yourself. And so holding on to that as your reinforcement, as opposed to getting a compliment from somebody else or having a person of color or another white person give you their gratitude, is really important. So how do we move past this? There's methods for ourselves in terms of how we can practice mindfulness to receive, reflect, and work to change our own behaviors. Release the need to be seen or heard or understood at that moment, that there's an impasse, and think less about your intentions and more focus on the impact that you've caused to someone. You don't have to understand the impact at that moment, and they don't have to understand your intentions. You just need to be present to learn about how that happened. Eliminate the word but and refrain against explaining. The more you can explore and understand the feedback, the better in these kinds of cases. You want to focus on gratitude, the meaning, and the purpose for the feedback. In this moment, are you more concerned about being perceived as a good person or someone who's always striving to be a better version of yourself? Take responsibility for it. You hurt somebody. You may not have done it intentionally, but you still did it. And it doesn't mean that you're necessarily a bad person or that you're mean, but every one of us does actions that are hurtful to others throughout our life. This is no different. Engage in self-compassion. We all have blind spots, and it's reinforced every day by the society that we live in to keep those blind to us. And again, don't have any expectations for affirmation from another person. There's a list of this, and I'll send these documents out to individuals who, when you fill out the end survey, there's an option to put your email. I'll happily send all this material to you. But there's a lovely document about why detour spotting and self-reflection. And I think it's just helpful in terms of both seeing the definition of it as well as the reality check and the consequence of these kinds of behaviors. So some of these we've already talked about: the rugged individualism, reverse racism is a very common one. And then the idea of blaming the victim, innocent by association. This lighten up is you're just too sensitive or thin-skinned. I didn't mean anything racist by it, right? This, we've overcome this, and saying like, oh, well, people marched in the 60s and did sit-ins with Dr. King. We had the president of the United States be Black, and so we're past this part of our country, which I think we're all kind of more aware more than ever that that's not the case now. And you know, this idea of even teach me, please, which again can be really well-meaning in terms of wanting to learn from other people, but BIPOC individuals are really tired, and you know, if you've been dealing with this your entire life, there's nothing that becomes more frustrating than continuing to feel like you have to be the one to educate them. We all have personal responsibility with this. It's important to do our own work, and there's plenty of resources and spaces that are coming up now to do that more than ever. There's also this white on white piece where we become a little righteous. And so I don't mean to come across this way. It might seem that way as I'm talking about it in this lecture, but the idea is not that it's like, oh, it's just those white people out there outside of the Zoom meeting. Obviously, all of us are fine, right? I'm guilty of this too. And I've done it, like even as recent as a few weeks ago. I know that I've cognizantly been aware of something where I equated people of color with low SES when I was talking to somebody about using different pictures for a flyer. And I had to take a step back, and I had to go back and apologize for that. It was not a point of pride for me, but you need to be aware that, again, these things will happen, and you need to continuously challenge yourself to grow from those experiences rather than shutting down or making excuses about it. There's this idea, again, of this certificate of innocence where you can almost want, you know, to be labeled as one of the good ones by getting public or private recognition and appreciation for what you do. And same with this accountant, this idea of like, you know, if you show this kind of feat of anti-racism, then you expect some reciprocity. This is going to be a thankless work, and you need to be okay with that. That's why, again, it's important to go back to this, the value that you set. When we talk about whites only, there's this idea that you have no connection or accountability with people of color, and that you only work with white people on anti-racism work. But this is part of our own entrenched society. Like, people of color are also can be racist, right? If we think about this as a label and the actions that you do, you can still support racist policy as a person of color. That's why when, you know, the president of the United States is a Black person, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden, you know, everyone else is like given a pass on their responsibility. There are people in power who identify as Black, and racism still runs rampant in police systems and government and other aspects of our lives. So not thinking that that just gives everything a pass in that. Silence is obviously a big one, and one of the ones that I think we're all most prone to because we're afraid of messing up. And we are going to mess up. This is part of the acceptance piece that we need to come in line with. It's not about being perfect. It's about recognizing that you're flawed, you're human, and as long as you continue to make efforts to change and to be better, then that needs to be enough. And it's also important to think about your own exhaustion and feeling despair about the hopelessness of the situation, because racism and all the isms of the world can feel really overwhelming. And we as white people have a privilege that we can take a step back and go away. Other people can't get away from that in their day-to-day lives. That doesn't mean that you should be burning the candle on both ends until you are completely spent and have, exhausted yourself completely. We want to balance self-care. You need to be in a good space to be able to do this work, but you need to be conscious of doing the work and not just using it as an excuse to wait until things are comfortable for you again every time. So micro-interventions, again, I'll hand out these slides because I want to be mindful of time. And there's so many different things that you can talk about in this. This is an article from Sue in 2007. It just gives a really nice chart in terms of how you can direct micro-intervention strategies towards a perpetrator, towards an institution, or towards more societal macroaggressions. And I think, again, you can think of this with each situation, like whether you want to express disagreement or, kind of do curiousness around like questioning, like, what does that joke mean? You can kind of play dumb and, have the person name the racist comment that they're making just to make it more apparent how offensive that is to the people around them. And continue to, again, find ways to intervene at the level that feels like it's going to be less defensive for that person. That could be education. It could just be disarming and deflecting to protect the person who's the target of it. Or you could be seeking to change your institution's culture and what you find acceptable in that. Other strategies to decrease defensiveness. Self-disclosure, I think, is one of the golden tools of group therapy that we talk about a lot in terms of how you're feeling at any moment can be really helpful in normalizing the experiences that other people have. And as well, if we can all admit to ourselves that we've made these mistakes, that we've, felt fear at different parts of our lives where we really didn't need to feel fear, but there's this inherent fear of the other or fear of Black, then it can be easier for others to not take that as defensive. Like they're not the only ones that are being accused of this label. But the more non-defensive, openness, and curious you can be in a dialogue, the easier it's going to be for them to be able to accept it. You need to let go of this idea of we need to win this argument and convince them in the moment. Think about this in terms of you're planting seeds for curiosity and exploration with each confrontation. And if you and others around us are all engaged in this kind of work, then this should be something that's reinforced more than once. This person's behavior should not just be called out by you, but hopefully will be a system that focuses on correcting and challenging people in this way. So do your part, and also don't feel like you have to come away with a victory for it to be worth it. Try and zoom out. Again, if you want to take it from the more systemic view of racism and have somebody realize, like, look, on this level, we're all going to have these difficulties and we're all going to say things that are offensive or that we inherently don't think about, to try and depersonalize the feedback, that it's not necessarily their fault that they are this way, and zooming back in about the impact that they had and the personal responsibility they need to take moving forward in that. Focus on the part of the person, again, the behavior, the action, the statement, the nonverbal that they did, and not labeling them as a person, as a whole being. This is something, again, in group therapy we do a lot. When we want somebody to change interpersonally, we don't just say, like, you're being vindictive. We say, when you raised your voice and you cut me off, I felt like you were vindictive, right? And I felt scared. So talking about that experience. Striking when the iron is cold, I like that as a strategy in terms of you can highlight positive interactions, feelings towards the person in the past that you've had where you've been, maybe grateful for their advocacy and their multicultural sensitivity, and express or in a desire to have more of that in their presence. Like the current behavior they're doing doesn't seem to align with the way that you viewed them before. So it's a softer way, and you can be a little less defensive about what comes up for them. Be familiar with facts, and that's something you have to do through your own education in terms of countering the stories or larger narratives that we get fed in media, and then connect to the person's internal values, again, and how they may align with yours. That can be really affirming. So really quickly, I'll go through these last things and then we'll get to some questions before we close. Just remember, again, you contain multitudes. You live in a system of have and have-nots. Life's a series of moments. You're not a permanent label in this. And you're going to do the best when you're willing to look at yourself entirely, hold your darkness to the light, recognize that we all have these parts of us, whether we wanted to or not. Be non-defensive and curious. Set your intentions aside. Nobody owes you a debate. Nobody owes you a relationship. If you've done someone harm, you have to accept that. You don't have all the pieces to someone's story, and you're not the only one hurt. So apologize, mean it, reflect on how you can be better, and then confront the feelings of shame or guilt that you may experience. Oops. Some of the resources in what you can do next, from a practical level to advocacy, I think it can just be helpful to consider these. I'll let everyone, take a look at this when I send out the PowerPoint. But remember that it's just important to think about the systems that you're in. These can be small groups, like in your workspace, your friend group, your family, your partner, and your relationship. And think about how you can make change in that space. All change is meaningful at every level of a system. Just because you're not at the highest level of government doesn't mean you can't have a significant impact and a ripple effect that can reach different members in the community that can be really helpful. So keep that in mind. And thank you all so much for your time. I just want to say the books that I used for this presentation were primarily from these 4. And then there are a bunch of resources on the last slide, which again, I will post for lots of other resources. You can be anti-racist and work towards racial justice. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording. Thanks everybody again.